so the idea that the state cannot be terrorists. It's also in how we label different organizations. Currently the US labels the PLO as a terrorist organization, yet Israeli groups that are very similar and conduct all the same violent acts are not labeled as terrorists. It's purely a semantical limiting of the political debate. And censorship does not always have to necessarily be negative. Also, working off of the theory of linguistic determinism is people-first language. The idea that how we label and talk about people will affect how we feel and think about them. So rather than saying a hemophiliac, we would say a person with hemophilia to denote that they have more than just that one identity. They are not just someone who has hemophilia, but a person with many different identities and many different labels, of which a medical condition is just one. So, the media is a huge institution that uses language to control how we think and what information we have access to. One of the primary ways it does this is it uses accent to give itself credibility. So for instance, the news corporation BBC has something called BBC English. So the newscasters are expected to speak a very certain dialect of English, something that is very clear and considered very proper, and that gives it a sense of authority, since those with heavier accents are usually linked with being less intelligent, completely arbitrarily. Also, the idea of audience design. So that is adjusting your register, the way you speak, to suit the audience you're talking to. Politicians will do this all the time. When they go into a rural, small community setting, they will put on maybe a heavier, more rural accent, and then when they go and talk at a college campus, they'll be speaking much more proper English. H.G. Wells did this in his radio broadcast program, where he spoke so authoritatively that people actually believed there was a Martian invasion. Also, content control. Media corporations are able to decide what news stories we even have access to. Many news stations will circulate each morning a memo saying what is to be talked about and what isn't, and how it is to be phrased. And that is certainly going to have an effect on how we think of world events. Lastly, the failure to fact-check and question sources. This currently happens all the time with the war in Afghanistan. Rather than actually talking to eyewitnesses, they will take press releases from the US government. For instance, there was recently an incident where US soldiers killed completely innocent people, but the official story from the US government was that they had actually just killed several women in an honor killing. That hadn't happened whatsoever, according to people who were actually there, but all major media sources reported it as the US retaliating for an honor killing. The school system. Most of us have been through the public school system, and we know the incredible power that has on the formative minds of young children. First of all, educational qualifications are used all the time to exclude different people from debate. So the idea that you cannot write any sort of authoritative academic book until you have a PhD, regardless of the fact that you may have done tons of outside research. You need that sort of certificate to be part of the academic elite. This has been used with women time and time again. Most recently, it was used at the turn of the century to quell emerging feminism. Earlier, women were not encouraged to be literate because it was afraid that if they were literate, they could write love letters and hold clandestine affairs. So it was very much tied in with power over women's sexuality. And then women, after that, were then seen as it was okay to read, but not to write. So they wanted women to be educated, but not opinionated. So the pen was seen as unwomanly, unfit for women to use. That's why many women took pen names that were male. And we've often linked literacy with social power. So the idea that you are inferior if you are not literate. There's thoughts that unliterate people are completely different species. They're completely separate, and it denotes a fundamental difference whether or not you can read and write. We use literacy in a tool in colonization. So when one place is conquered by another, the dominant group's language is then imposed, and that's a form of social control. Here in America, we use we instituted mass public education in order to instill morals to the masses. It was the idea that they were sort of this teeming, unorganized mass, and that literacy would be a way to control them and make them more rational. It was also an attempt to make them more effective, more economically productive workers. And then later on, post-desegregation, ideas about what proper literacy is often place black children in slow tracks because they grew up with like different sorts of norms and mores around literacy. For instance, asking questions was not as encouraged in black communities at that time, and so when teachers would ask questions, often children of color wouldn't respond, not because they didn't know the answers, but because they were not used to being directly addressed with questions. Also, storytelling versus lying. White children with access to lots of print material at a very young age were sort of taught the art of storytelling, and that creativity was very encouraged. Whereas in communities of color, that was often seen as lying, and it wasn't supported. So then children of color often had a very hard time adjusting to the sort of storytelling mode of education in the US. So we already mentioned, but public school as a tool to instill obedience, and it also gave rise to the concept of the US as a nation. Before that, it was sort of this collection of different small groups, mostly different immigrant populations. But finally, with the circulation of print material and a raising level of general literacy, people could talk about sort of the nation as this symbolic entity. People could begin to feel a part of it. Out of that arose, the ideas about standard English, both in reaction to immigrants from outside the U.S. and also from rural communities. So the idea that English suddenly had to be policed, that only certain people speak the right kind of English, and it was certainly a way for those in power to retain that power, because of course it was their language that was taken as standard English. Most of the changes are very arbitrary. It's just, a decision. You can say it this way or you can say it that way, and it doesn't really matter. It's mostly done to conserve the power of the dominant group. And then after that has been codified, those who speak non-standard English are then seen as uneducated and unintelligent. It's also, this plays into current debates on whether or not, bilingual education should be allowed. And in a greater sense, it's policing who gets access to education, who is allowed to learn and gain a bit of that linguistic, that intellectual power within our society. Deborah Cameron, in her work, talked about how grammar is a metaphor for morality and related ideas such as order and authority, the conditions for an ordered society.